Hi, Chris.
Hey, Bob.
How are
How's it
you?
going? I'm good, thank you. How about you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast on your favorite podcast app. You're Chris Stedman. And you most recently came to my attention for writing this piece in Vice called Too Many Atheists Are Veering Dangerously Toward the Alt-Right. And I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about that. But first, I want to talk about the context in which you first came to my attention, which is back when you were the humanist or a humanist chaplain or something at Yale. And I think previously you had done roughly the same thing at Harvard.
That's correct, yeah.
And you had written this book, Faitheist, that was about your own kind of path. I mean, you're an atheist, but not an anti-theist.
That's correct.
Correct. You're not big on ridiculing people's religious beliefs. In contrast to some atheists we could mention if we wanted to, and we may yet. But anyway, why don't like I said, I want to get into this really interesting phenomenon that you say exists of a kind of intersection between atheism and the alt-right. But first, what do you do when you're a humanist chaplain at an Ivy League college? Like, who is your flock and what do they do?
Well, I don't think I ever had a flock, but so when I first started at Harvard, I was one of a couple of chaplains there, and we also had additional support staff that were running various programs, but essentially what I was doing was I was working with a team of people to help support a community for atheists, agnostics, spiritual but not religious people sometimes were involved, humanists, and so on. And, in many ways, what we were trying to do was to respond to a lot of the same human needs that are often met in religious spaces. So the need for congregation or community, to be among like-minded others and have a space where you can not only reflect on your values and what's important in your life, but also be held accountable to those things and be prompted to reflect on those things and learn and grow. And also a place from which you can act on your values, how you can sort of re-enter the world as a sort of engaged citizen. And part of why I ultimately was drawn to doing that work in the community at Harvard and then later through the program at Yale was years ago I read a book by Robert Putnam and David Campbell called American Grace. I'm sure you're familiar. And one of the things they talk about in American Grace is how religious Americans, according to research they did, are more civically engaged than non-religious Americans are in a number of ways. So they vote more. Evangelical Christians have a voter registration rate that's 3 times higher than the non-religious do. They volunteer more in their broader communities. They give more money to charity, both religious and secular. Putnam and Campbell say that, in the United States, religious people are better neighbors than the non-religious. They also found that a non-believing spouse of a religious person who was involved in their spouse's religious community was just as civically engaged as the believing spouse was. And because of this, they suggest that the correlation between being civically engaged, being involved in your community and contributing to your community has less to do with the particularities of what you believe and more to do with a sense of belonging, with being a part of a community where you can reflect on your life, where you can be held accountable, and so on. And they actually go as far as suggesting that morally oriented communities for non-religious people could play a similar role in helping non-religious people be more civically engaged. So prior to working as a humanist chaplain, I was working for an organization in Chicago called Interfaith Youth Corps, which helps get young people of many different religious and non-religious backgrounds together to try to better understand each other and identify areas.
Is that the Eboo Patel thing?
It is, yep. Yeah.
He started that, I guess.
He did, yep. And so I was working for that organization and trying to figure out how to expand what they were doing to make sure that non-religious people were a part of those initiatives. And what I kind of realized was that if I really wanted to see it become easier for non-religious people to get involved in initiatives like that, that actually it felt important to invest in spaces, in sort of building and supporting spaces where non-religious people could then sort of go back out into the world from there. And so, that ultimately is what I did for the better part of a decade. And it looked like a lot of things. It looked like regular community gatherings with speakers. I did a lot of one-on-one counseling with people who were sort of struggling with meaning and purpose in their lives. And again, a lot of these same sort of needs that people get met in a religious space, we tried to create ways for people to meet those needs in a secular way.
Okay, and how did you wind up where you were? You at one point were you identified as an evangelical at one point? Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So I actually grew up secular. I grew up in Minnesota, where I'm back now, in a non-religious household. And really, actually, more than anything, we were sort of irreligious. We just didn't talk about religion. I didn't hear the word atheist in my household growing up, but I didn't hear the word God either. We just weren't. But when I was 11, I had a conversion experience and became a born-again Christian. And looking back on that conversion, I think there were sort of two reasons why that happened. The first is that at the time of my conversion, my parents were going through a divorce, and it was a very sort of disruptive event. And so I was looking for a community where I could find some stability and some support during that time. But I think the biggest reason was about a year prior to converting, I had started to read books like Roots by Alex Haley and Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl and Hiroshima. And so these were books that not only increased my awareness of some of the greatest atrocities that have occurred in the history of human civilization, they also told the stories of what it was like for people to experience those things in a way that filled me with a profound desire to understand what it meant about being human, that we could do these things to each other. And I felt like I was learning about the events described in these books in school, but just as sort of historical fact, right, as things that happened, and not as these kind of moral questions that cause us to look inward and ask what our responsibility is to sort of address those things.
That seems like an unusually intellectual path for an 11-year-old to take.
I mean,
it's funny. I was probably not 11. I was probably 9 or 10 when, I was actually brought up Southern Baptist, but I did have the experience of choosing at one point to, you're familiar with the thing, accepting what was called the invitation that the minister would issue, and going up front, and then that led to getting baptized and everything. And that was a very powerful emotional experience that got me to do that.
Yeah.
My parents were surprised, but it was not nearly as cerebral as I really feel bad.
Well, I don't think I would have articulated it in exactly that way at that time, right? But I definitely was a very introspective child. I spent a lot of time in my head. And part of the reason why was because my conversion actually coincided with a third thing, which was that this emerging recognition that I was queer. And
that was happening
right around the time of my conversion. Yep. And so, I had sort of always known that was there, although I couldn't really articulate that either. And so, because of that, for a lot of my childhood, I spent a lot of time sort of in my head, and so, I think that's a big part of why I was really drawn to reflecting on those kinds of things.
Although most people would find it ironic. You were choosing a faith that probably at that point, and still in some cases, was not known for its warm embrace of gay people, right?
No, in fact, the church that I converted into wasn't just theologically conservative. It was really fixated on issues of sexuality to a point of sort of near obsession. They would find ways to bring up gay people specifically although they would refer to it as same-sex attraction, but they would find ways to bring that up in a really negative way no matter how, they would reference it in a sermon, no matter how unrelated it seemed to be. And honestly, I think part of why I was drawn to that expression of Christianity, part of it was that I was just, I happened to be invited to this after school youth group that met at this church by some acquaintances from school. But I think part of why it resonated is that I didn't really want to be queer. I didn't see any other queer people around me. And it was a way in which I was different from everybody else. And so this community said that was something that I wasn't doomed to be, that I could get around it. And I think the second thing is the community was about certainty, right? It was saying, I was doing a lot of thinking about myself and who I was, and also about these sort of books I had read and these questions I had as a result. And this community provided very concrete, certain sort of answers to those things. And so I think that was, a big part of what drew me to it. But of course, right, that was the big irony, was that I came to Christianity looking to connect with other people, to be in community, and to make sense of these swirling questions of injustice and suffering. And what happened as a result was, when I recognized that I was queer, I ended up really sort of going internal and withdrawing from everyone around me as I struggled with this and tried to change my sexual orientation through these the practices that I read in books that said I could. And I my own sort of personal suffering increased really significantly. But a few years into that process, something very fortunate happened. My mother was, I think, very concerned. She saw me sort of withdrawing from the world around me. And so she found this journal that I was keeping where I was writing about what I was struggling with. And she read it, which at the time I was horrified by. But in hindsight, I'm really grateful for, because, my mother, who was not particularly religious herself, I think she didn't really know how to walk with me through what I was struggling with, but she did something really amazing. She went to the phone book, she called up churches in the community, and she found an LGBT affirming Lutheran pastor and took me to talk with him.
Wow, that's a good mother.
Yes, the best. And so she took me to talk with him. He gave me this huge stack of books, which you may guess at this point was very appealing to me. And but really what the most important thing he did was he told me that this issue was a lot more complicated than what I had been told, and that there wasn't just this one way of looking at it, as I, again, had been told. And so because of that, I ended up moving into more progressive Christian churches. I found that space that I had been looking for, where I was welcomed for who I was, where I could reflect on these things that were really important to me. And because of that, I was all the more interested in sort of trying to make sense of injustice and trying to work with people who were struggling with things like I had. And so by the time I graduated from high school, I decided I wanted to go to a Lutheran college to study religion, because, the people who had kind of helped me make sense of a lot of these things were Lutherans. But when I got to that college where I am now,
you've gone back there after your journey east.
Yes, so I'm back here now doing a couple of fellowships.
And the name of the college is Augsburg?
It's Augsburg University. Yeah, they switched to university recently. But so when I was here, I was studying religion, and I came in being considering myself religious. But through the process of studying religion, I was sort of challenged by my religion professors, all of whom were Christian themselves, to ask myself what I believed and why I believed it, and to really sort of critically look at my own beliefs and what my relationship to the things I was studying was. And it was through that process that I came to recognize that for me, Christianity had always been more about the function and less about the theology, which to me had actually really never sat all that comfortably. I always felt like I was trying to convince myself that I believed things that I didn't in order to get this other stuff. And so by the time I was done with my degree here, I no longer considered myself a Christian or a believer. And yet, because so often these conversations around religion can be, on a sort of broader cultural level, can be so polarized, I had very kind of conflicted feelings about religion, especially because of some of my own personal struggles with my sexual orientation and my faith. And so, for a time I was pretty sort of negative in my outlook on religion. But it was, as time went on, and I continued to sort of be put in situations where I was forced to recognize that religion as a sort of human phenomenon is much more complex than the ways that I had been thinking about it at that point. I eventually decided that I wanted to sort of take another look at it, which is what led me to pursue my master's also in religion.
Okay. So then you eventually did go east and do these things at Harvard and Yale, where I gather you were trying to preserve some of what religion brings that is good. Sense of community, a sense of, community with moral orientation, but without the theistic underpinnings. And I would think it's a challenge because of the diversity of the people you described as belonging to the community. Now, you might, you use the word seeker as one of the kinds of people. I would think that in some sense they were all seekers just because, not that all atheists are, but I would think that atheists who go to seek, the guidance or whatever from the humanist chaplain are seeking something that maybe other atheists aren't. I guess my question is, do people have anything in common or enough in common for to kind of forge community?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things there. I think one, it's actually, so most of the people that I worked with as a humanist chaplain over the years were sort of pretty set in what they already thought about the world. They weren't really, I think, seeking to figure out, and they certainly weren't coming to me to tell them what to think or what to believe. But for the most part, I was working with people who were sort of struggling with challenges in life, who, a number of people who I worked with actually were people who were formerly religious and were trying to sort of figure out how to think about things that they cared about in a sort of secular way. And my role, I always saw my role not as, again, being someone who can give them an answer, because what do I know? Mm-hmm. Rather, I was, my goal was to be a kind of accompanier, to walk with them through that process, to be someone that they could reflect with, who potentially could point them in the direction of resources, but really was just about a reflection partner. But the second piece, that you sort of touched on there is, I think, one challenge, and this maybe sort of leads into a conversation around the vice piece you mentioned. One challenge for atheism and humanism as a sort of organized force, as a movement, as a community of people, is that there have been a lot of efforts made, in part because the most sort of visible representatives of the community have tended to be more aligned with atheism and more aligned with anti-theism. There tends to be this sense that we should organize our community around atheism, just around sort of not believing in God. Mm-hmm. But the challenge with that is that it leaves everything else open for disagreement. There's just not a whole lot of there. Not to say that atheism isn't important. I would say that atheism is the sort of center of my worldview, or maybe the sort of first step in my worldview, and everything else about it sort of grows out from there, right? So if I take seriously the idea that it's unlikely there are any divine or supernatural forces that are going to intervene in human affairs and address our problems, that's a big part of what kind of motivates me to act in the world. But part of why I consider myself a humanist and why I'm drawn to humanism as a way of sort of orienting our communities is it's a robust set of values and affirmations that go beyond just saying we don't believe in God. And so if you look at someone like Richard Spencer, for example.
You'd say what does what beyond it? It affirms the value and importance of human life. And
exactly, the inherent worth and dignity of all people, the responsibility that we have toward not just serving our own aims, but taking into consideration the common good and drawing on the sort of vast amount of human insight that we've developed over the years in order to try to work for the common good. And so I could look at someone like Richard Spencer, who I write about in that Vice piece, who, is an atheist, who has talked about how his atheism is related to his worldview.
Who's generally identified as either neo-Nazi or white nationalist or something. Maybe the most famous one in America.
Yeah, he claims to have coined the term alt-right, and he's kind of seen as the leader of the so-called alt-right. He is, yes, a white nationalist.
He does not himself identify as a Nazi, a neo-Nazi. Is that right, or does he?
I don't believe that he does, but he is, and he's a Nazi. And so he did this interview. He actually did 2 interviews with a very popular atheist website where he talked about how he's an atheist, and he talked about how his atheism is linked to his worldview. So he talks about how part of why he rejects religion is because, religion as he sees it says that we are all one, that all people are sort of equal in the eyes of God. And of course, he's talking specifically about sort of Abrahamic religions, but, so he says that's part of why he rejects religion and why he's an atheist. And so he's making a link there. And actually, he went even further when he reposted the first interview on his own website, on the alt-right website. He retitled it The Alt-Right and Secular Humanism. So he's not just linking himself to atheism, he's also linking himself to humanism. But if you look at what humanism actually says, what humanism is about, you can look at the things that Richard Spencer says that he believes, the things he promotes, the things he does in the world, and you can say that doesn't align with humanism. But what I can't do is I can't say Richard Spencer is not an atheist. And so I think one of our problems, and one of the reasons why atheism as a movement and as a kind of organized force has struggled with some really sort of volatile disagreements around racism and sexism and a host of other sort of issues and conversations, is because atheism as a sort of orienting principle doesn't really give you the ability to say these are things that we all agree on, we all affirm, and it makes it harder to say these are the priorities that we have as a movement, and to draw the boundaries around that a bit more.
Okay. Well, there's a lot there, and we should say, I don't think I mentioned this, what you wrote in this Vice piece has drawn the wrath of Jerry Coyne, well-known new atheist, whose wrath I have drawn more than once. And so this has become a little bit controversial. So before we get into that more, I want to get back to this kind of connection between what you were doing at Yale and Harvard and the piece you wrote for Vice, or at least a kind of connection, which is that I spoke to a group, the humanist chaplain at Columbia, another Ivy League school, asked me to come in and talk to the students who were her humanists, and I was really surprised. This is maybe 2-3 years ago, by how anti-theistic they were, and how there were a lot of, it seemed like, pretty fervent Sam Harris fans there. I mean, I was kind of trying to convince them that religion is not inherently bad. It's a complicated question, much more complicated than you would guess to read the famous Chris Hitchens book about in which he says religion poisons everything. But they were, I was a little surprised, and to the extent that they were anti-theistic, of course, they are on the opposite side of an argument from you, because you are decidedly not anti-theistic, and this is part of the backdrop of your most recent kind of interaction with Jerry Coyne. He's criticized you before, but just to be clear, was this your experience in Yale and Harvard that there was a pretty strong anti-theistic current in the students you dealt with?
I would say less so at Harvard and Yale. I mean, certainly, I worked with students over the years who had a range of different sort of perspectives on this, but definitely less so in those groups. I would say more so in the sort of broader movement in, when I would go to national conferences, or if you look at the sort of popular blogs or who the sort of most visible advocates are. But it's, I think it's a false representation, because, all communities have this issue where the kind of loudest and most volatile voices are the ones that you hear the loudest. But, you look at Westboro Baptist Church, for example, they're an example of a fringe extremist Christian group that has a disproportionate level of influence in our broader discourse. And now, I'm not saying that Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or whoever is the same as the Westboro Baptist Church, but just using them as an example, they have a greater influence. They're not actually super representative of the views of Christians more broadly. But the issue is, if you see the Westboro Baptist Church and you're, a sort of random person in the United States, I am willing to imagine that you probably know other Christians. And so you have other kind of data points when it comes to developing your understanding of Christianity. You can say, okay, there's that group there, but I know that there are other kinds of Christians. The problem that a lot of atheists face is that we are a much smaller community. We're less than 10% of the population. And So a lot of people don't know atheists or don't know that they know atheists. And so, those voices tend to sort of represent in their minds who atheists are. And yet, if you look at the actual sort of demographics, I think they reveal that that's actually not the case. For example, there was a study which I reference in the Vice piece out of the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga a few years back that found that, so they surveyed members of atheist and secular organizations, where I think you would expect to find the sort of most passionate people, the ones who are drawn to getting involved in those organizations and who are drawn to organizations that tend to be represented by people who have a more anti-religious perspective. And yet they found even among those people, less than 15% said that they were anti-theists. So that's, and so if you take that number at face value, that's a very small minority of atheists overall. And yet I would actually guess that that's an overrepresentation because they were drawing from atheist organizations, but still, that's a small percentage of atheists. And I think those of us who have a different perspective, who are not anti-theists, often our voices don't get heard as frequently, and our perspectives aren't represented in the broader discourse. And the other thing about that University of Tennessee at Chattanooga study is that they also found, and this is what I say in the Vice piece, that those who were anti-theists had the highest levels of dogmatism and anger. And I think that is why we see, in part, and this is something we can get into more, but that's part of where I think we see some link or intersection between movement atheism as an organized force, and some segments of the alt-right.
Yeah. Okay. So one other point before we proceed to the alt-right. I gather that Faitheist, the title of your book, that is a term of disparagement that is leveled by anti-theists toward atheists who are, in their view, a little too sympathetic to religion or something. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's directed toward atheists and was directed to me in the past, but it's directed toward atheists who are seen as too soft on religion, too sympathetic, as not having the sort of correct approach to a relationship with religion, which is a more sort of hostile or challenging kind of orientation.
Okay.
But yeah, I decided I wanted to reclaim that term, sort of tongue in cheek, but there's also, there's a tradition of reclamation that I'm a part of as a queer person. Queer is a term that has been weaponized against my community, and there's a kind of a power in taking it back. And I think I felt inspired to say, this term that has been used against me in a negative way is something I want to sort of reclaim.
Okay. So on the alt-right thing, I was the Richard Spencer. One interesting thing in your piece was that his rejection of religion. He sees the Abrahamic tradition as bad because it is inclusive. Because I guess he sees it as preaching universal brotherhood or something, which he thinks is too inclusive, right?
Yeah, he sees it as a sort of equalizer, or as a saying as a way of saying that, we're all the same in the eyes of God. And I think he, believes that there are real differences between people of different races. And so, I think that's part of the issue he has with religion. And I think, look, as I say in the Vice piece, he does not represent the majority of atheists. In fact, the majority of atheists, if you look at the actual sort of Pew data, for example, are, they tend to be more progressive than other populations. If you look at the sort of last election, atheists voted for, Hillary Clinton much more so than many other groups. And so I'm not saying that atheists have a bigger problem with the alt-right than other communities, but I am saying that there are specific features of movement atheism that I think leave members of the sort of organized atheist community vulnerable to alt-right intrusion or encroachment or kind of recruitment.
Okay, so yeah, talk about that. The idea that, the question arises, if indeed there is some kind of correlation here. There's a couple of different things going on. There are people there are new atheist elites or atheist elites who are well-known people who have been accused of maybe being right-wing in particular senses, or being misogynistic,
Sure.
whatever. There's that, but then there's also this, and I want to talk about that, but there's also this kind of, at the grassroots level, apparently this actual intersection of alt-right and atheism. You know, you look at the demographic data and the voting data,
Right.
you know, you link in your piece to this piece in the Atlantic by Peter Beinart, which I hadn't previously read, and he notes that data, that really the people who seem that the alt-right seems to disproportionately involve people who are either atheists or who are evangelicals who actually don't go to church much.
Right.
So go ahead.
Yeah, it's a confluence of sort of circumstances here. So there's a few things going on. One, as you say, there's demographic overlap. So if you look at the kind of demographic data, atheists tend to be more likely to be young white men than the general public, which is also true of the alt-right. So already there's some sort of demographic overlap there. But it goes beyond that. I mean, one other thing that I reference in the Vice piece is this is George Hawley, who studied the alt-right, who talks about how not only is the alt-right predominantly young white men, but he also says it tends to be more secular, more atheist and agnostic than the general population is. And so there's the demographic overlap. Part of why I think that that's concerning is you've got this population of people, these young white men who are kind of deinstitutionalized, right? So they're not a part of communities, or they're less likely to be a part of communities where they are prompted to reflect on their values, to be held accountable to their beliefs. And so they're more isolated. They also, atheists tend to face more social isolation, period, because they're a very negatively viewed group. Pew found that atheists are statistically tied with Muslims for being the most negatively viewed religious or philosophical community. So you've got this population of people who tend to be more likely to be young white men who face social isolation, sometimes experience family rejection, and who are perhaps more likely to be seeking out community online because atheism as a movement is very much sort of driven by the internet. A lot of people make their way into the atheist movement through the internet. And then when you combine those things with the fact that we know the alt-right intentionally targets people who are sort of isolated, who are seeking purpose and belonging and a sense of identity and community, and then you've got these, as you sort of touched on, you've got these big names in atheism who, while they do certainly champion liberal and progressive views on certain issues, are also championing ideas that are at least, and again, I would not call any of these big names in atheism alt-right themselves, but they're lifting up things that are sort of aligned. There may be a few steps out, and they're also associating themselves with figures who are sort of involved in the alt-right or closer to the alt-right. And so there was this piece in The Guardian, for example, which I don't talk about in my Vice piece, where someone wrote about how they started by sort of following Sam Harris, and that led them down this kind of rabbit hole from Sam Harris to Milo to others. And they say that following Sam Harris is part of sort of what led them to being involved in the alt-right. And in fact, I think it was just a week ago or less, the Southern Poverty Law Center put out this piece that talked about how a lot of people, they specifically studied this one group, but they were saying a number of these people were citing Sam Harris as kind of the gateway that got them involved in this. And so, I think it's a phenomenon that I've observed over the years, because I've been involved in organized and movement atheism for the better part of a decade now. And I've watched as some of these bigger names in atheism, and not just, the Sam Harrises and Dawkins, but even people who are sort of a few steps down from there, Jerry Coyne, others, who have shifted more and more of their focus from kind of attacking or criticizing what they would call dogmatic religionists to they've shifted a good amount of that attention toward what they would call dogmatic social justice warriors. And they're kind of putting them in the same category. And they're saying, that there are these religious people that we oppose, and then there are these, regressive left people that we oppose. And I think part of what has allowed that transition to happen is that there are some, and this is, so I spoke with James Croft, who is a humanist and atheist community organizer and blogger about this, and I talk about this in the Vice piece. I think that there are some shared sort of features of atheism as a movement and the alt-right that make that transition sort of possible. And one of them is this sense that I think exists in both communities of people that tend to be more likely to be sort of cisgender, straight, white men than maybe some other groups, or at least where those voices are more dominant. There tends to be this kind of feeling in both groups that they are.
Can you tell people who might not know what cisgender means?
Cisgender.
Yeah.
Yeah, cisgender is someone who identifies with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So I am a cisgender person, for example. But so I think that there's this feeling in both of these groups that, again, tend to sort of be more likely to be young white men than the general public, and where those voices tend to have be driving the conversation more. There's this feeling in both groups that they are the sort of last defenders of unfettered free inquiry. They're the sort of truth tellers who are willing to challenge the kind of polite norms of society. And I think because that ethos has some similarities in both groups, it makes it easier for some people to go from sort of focusing on religion as the source of the world's problem and being problems in their eyes and being anti-theistic to shifting some of that to say, now the problem isn't just religion, it's also these social justice warriors, right, as they put it. It's, the feminists and so on.
It's an interesting dynamic. I've been kind of observing this for a while because I think 9 years ago, more than that maybe, I wrote what I think was the first piece saying that the new atheists were de facto right-wing on foreign policy. I was just talking about foreign policy.
Sure.
I said the reason is they attribute conflict to religious belief. Richard Dawkins said, if it weren't for religion, there would be no Israel-Palestine conflict, which is really a stupid thing to say. I'm sorry, but if you understand the history of that, it wasn't about religion initially. It's about two ethnic groups who want the same piece of land. But and it was not really religiously infused at all. It wasn't anyway. And so as a result, they don't see kind of facts on the ground as contribute. They don't look for the root causes of conflict. They don't, and so they're able to kind of dismiss the possible legitimacy of any grievances that any of America's antagonists might have in the current kind of environment, where, as it happens, most of the groups America is fighting have something to do with Islam. So I made that argument, and I still think it's true, but I didn't think of the new atheists or any of them as necessarily being right-wing in a much broader sense. Now, I did note that they seem to spend a disproportionate amount of time disparaging one particular religion, which was Islam. And if you ask...
And not just that, and sorry to interrupt, but not just that, it's also the ways in which they talk about Islam and a sort of unwillingness to take into account that when they're criticizing Christianity in the United States, they're talking about the dominant religion. And so there are ways in which you can talk about that, I think, that, make a lot of sense. But when you're talking about Islam in the United States, you're talking about a minority community, right, that experiences disproportionate levels of violence and hate crimes. And I think there's often an unwillingness to think about the ways in which they talk about Islam in this specific context, especially.
Right. A related issue came up in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo thing, like the distinction between ridiculing powerful groups and ridiculing less powerful groups.
Right, as people often describe it, punching up versus punching down.
Punching down, right. So,
yeah.
So I mean, so if you had asked me, well, wait, how do you get from Sam Harris to Milo? You said there are people who say that was kind of the migration they made. The only real guess I would have had would be that, well, Milo is, he certainly spends a fair amount of time disparaging Islam, and I would say Muslims, although, certainly some subset of Muslims. And so I kind of see a connection, even though, I want to emphasize in Sam's defense, I don't think we can be held entirely responsible for who happens to agree with us on things, right?
Sure.
So the fact like I just saw some stat, maybe you saw this, it was just circulating in the last few days about favorite people who are read by the alt-right. There was a bunch of things you would expect, like Breitbart, InfoWars, and then the first one you wouldn't expect was Sam Harris.
Right.
And I don't, he can't help who, you have to say what you believe in. If
I agree with that, but I would also,
yeah.
I mean, if I saw that list and I saw my name on there, the first thing that I would do is ask myself questions about why.
I agree with that too.
And it's not
self-examination is maybe in order. Yes.
It's not just happenstance. They don't just happen to, I mean, there are things about, the narrative that Sam Harris pushes and some of the guests that he hosts on his podcast and, the people that he is in conversation with. I mean, he's doing events with Ben Shapiro. He's doing events with Jordan Peterson. I mean, and I don't believe that you are responsible necessarily for every single thing that, is said or promoted by someone that you happen to do an event with. But I do think that there's a difference between, having a hard conversation with someone that you really disagree with and continuing to sort of share a stage and a platform with people who are, I think one step closer to what we're talking about. But I will say, I mean, I think part of why, part of this conversation is that for a number of atheists, atheism is, and I'll acknowledge this has been true for me in the past as well. I mean, this is not something that I've never struggled with, but for a lot of atheists, atheism is not just about saying this is based on what I've studied, what I've experienced, what I perceive in the world, my best understanding of things. This is the conclusion I've come to. It's not, atheism is not just about that for some atheists. For some atheists, it's also about a feeling of superiority, about feeling that they are correct and other people are not. Yeah. And what happens, I think, sometimes with some atheists, and again, I think it's very important to be clear, we're talking about a minority of atheists here, but with some atheists, they decide when they buy into this narrative that religion is the sort of source of problems and that without religion, we would have a sort of better world. We wouldn't have some of these conflicts. What that allows you to do is to say, all of these things that are bad are in the category of religion. So racism, that's a religious problem, or that's caused by religion. Sexism, that's caused by religion. Homophobia, transphobia, etc. These are religious things. And so if I reject religion, I'm not complicit in those things anymore. I can't possibly be racist or homophobic or sexist. I can, lift up certain things, but and I think what it causes is it makes it harder to do that sort of self-interrogation, that self-critical work, to look inward and ask yourself what ways you still participate in these kinds of things when you've said religion is the problem and I've rejected religion, so therefore I'm not a part of that problem anymore.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are a number of tribes in the world who in one sense or another feel superior, if only in the sense of believing that their version of the truth is purer or something. There's certainly
absolutely
religious tribes. There are national tribes. I mean, the average American just thinks America is just better, right? And so
and I think
Obama said which in one of a number of political mistakes he made, he was saying, and if I were French, I'd think France was best. You're not supposed to say that part if you're an American president, but I think it's fine
to believe that you are correct and to believe that, and to look at, I mean, for me, my atheism has really positively impacted my life. And so, it makes sense to me that you would want to, if this thing has positively impacted your life, that you would want to see it positively impact other people's lives as well. And, all of that makes sense. And I think you can operate out of that position without doing it in a way that, I think reduces the complexity of what religion is and how it functions for people.
Yeah. No, but I take your point, and I think this is, it's an air that some of the prominent new atheists kind of exude that drives people crazier than they may realize, or maybe they don't mind driving people crazy, but this air of intellectual superiority. I am the calm rationalist. I am not the problem. We are not the problem. It's the other groups, it's the other tribes that are the problem. And one reason I think that's misleading is that the new atheists I've spoken a couple of times in terms of in front of audiences that were heavily new atheists. When I debated Sam in Los Angeles, then when I did an event with Lawrence Krauss in New York, and a lot of his fans came, and I'd say, and I saw this more in LA than in New York, but they behave in tribal fashion to some extent,
Sure.
and I think they suffer from some of the same, you might say, cognitive biases or whatever that constitute tribalism as the rest of us. And I mean,
Right.
and the sense they exude sometimes that they are here to enlighten the world when they arguably manifest the same problems that the rest of the world manifests is kind of annoying. Now,
right. And this is, I mean, I don't think atheists are necessarily worse about this than other groups. But
no, I don't think it's worse. I just think a lot of them think they're better. And I'm not sure.
Part of what I struggle with is and this goes back to what I was saying before. If you've decided that that's something religious people do and therefore you can't be doing the same kind of thing, then I think there's, a lack of self-awareness or being self-critical there. And this is something I've experienced over the years as I have been, I've written a lot of things that are, about defending atheists. I've gone on television to defend atheists when we've been, marginalized and criticized. But I've also written some things that are critical of things within our own community. And there's often a very knee-jerk kind of reactionary response to those things. And to me, it is indicative of the fact that, atheists are just like everybody else. We struggle with tribalism. We struggle with in-group, out-group thinking. And it reveals that this idea that religion is always the problem is kind of a house of cards. And I think that's part of why people, don't want to acknowledge that we have these issues in atheist communities, is because it kind of undoes that, it undoes that narrative. It disentangles this idea that religion is the source of these issues. And, I know that this is anecdotal and therefore will be dismissed, but over the years, as someone who has been, sort of criticized by some fellow atheists, a lot of the criticism I've gotten over the years has been sort of homophobic in nature. And I remember when I went
implicitly or explicitly.
So sometimes more subtly, but sometimes very overtly. And I remember this is something I wrote about last fall in the Washington Post, when I was talking about sort of why I've stopped writing about atheism online as much as I used to. And one of the reasons was because of this kind of experience I've had. I remember I went on Fox News to do the now non-existent Bill O'Reilly program. And
that must have been quite an experience.
It was, yes. But I remember feeling good about how the conversation went, considering, what that environment is like. But afterwards, I heard from a number of atheists who said that they didn't want me speaking on behalf of atheists or representing our community because it made us look like freaks. It made us, my sort of obvious homosexuality, as someone said, made me not a good representative for atheism. The fact that I was effeminate, as they said. And, that really, I would say what I'd characterize the majority of the responses that I got to that Fox interview that were negative were sort of homophobic in nature, either explicitly or implicitly. And, what that tells me is, again, not that atheists are more homophobic than other groups. In fact, I would say if you look at the data, they're less. But it does show you that these issues, and this is something that many of my friends who've been involved in movement atheism, who are women, who are people of color, who are gender nonconforming or transgender, have also experienced, is that atheists are human beings, and we have many of the same implicit biases. We've inherited a lot of the same cultural norms, and that doesn't make atheists worse. But what is a problem is when we don't do that self sort of interrogation, and we can't turn the critical eye inward. And I think part of why I really struggle with it is that we claim to be a community that really values skepticism, that really values critical thinking. And what it suggests to me is that your skepticism, if it can only be directed outward and not inward, then it's kind of toothless, and you don't actually value it. And I believe that, those are important things to value, and that our community should value them, not just directed toward other groups, but also inward.
I think you tell me, whether this observation is related to what you're saying, but when I did the thing with Sam Harris in Los Angeles, and by the way, I mean, he was received, I guess it's too much to say he was received like the Messiah, but he was received like a rock star.
Sure.
I mean, by that crowd. I mean, it was in some ways an enviable position to be in. And in the Q&A afterwards, in terms of like what provides the kind of passion and energy behind that kind of adulation, I got a sense that I hadn't gotten before, that a number of the people who are like movement atheists, who like show up for these things at least, had feel that they had been damaged by religion as kids. Some of them had had intensely religious upbringings, and they felt that had really hurt them, and so they had a grievance and they had an enemy. And religion was kind of their own personal enemy. Now, that was just I don't know how representative that was. Is, in your experience, is that a prominent theme?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant, and in general, I try not to sort of make sweeping generalizations about these things. But I mean, it's not a factor, And in that sense, I am sympathetic often. I mean, I too have religious trauma and have experienced quite acutely the harm that often is done in the name of religion. But part of what honestly has helped me make peace with my own religious trauma is coming to recognize the complexity of religion, to recognize that it's not all bad or all good, but that it is a human phenomenon that that is an attempt to make sense of things that don't make sense, and to sort of give people the opportunity to reflect on those things. And what I understand where the sort of negative perspective on religion comes from. And it makes sense in many ways, because we live in a conflict-oriented world where the stories that get told are stories of conflict. And so the driving cultural discourse on religion is this clash of civilizations model. And so I understand when you look out at the world, you see this clash of civilizations, that's the story that's getting told. And especially if you have personal trauma around religion, which I have, I understand, how you sort of land in that place. But ultimately, I think if you want to see religious communities become less of a space of harm, less a place where harm is done to people, then I think, it's important to want to support efforts to reform those communities. I mean, though I'm no longer a Christian, continue to work with Christians who are trying to make their communities more inclusive of LGBT people. And I think that is really important. And I'll tell you, if someone had come to me when I was an adolescent and had said, when I was struggling with my Christianity and my sexual orientation, if someone had come to me and said, it's all bullshit, just toss it out and, embrace your sexual orientation and forget about religion, it wouldn't have worked, right? I needed someone who could speak out of a Christian perspective and give me another point of view. And I certainly think that, folks like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens have, I wouldn't say that, well, I don't believe that their perspective on religion is correct. Right. I will say that they have done, they haven't just done harm, though I think there has been some harm done. They've also done a lot of good things. They've made atheism more visible, more available. It's, more of an option to people. And they've also made space for people to articulate their own trauma. But what I think is unfortunate is when people get stuck in that place of trauma rather than, and I'm not saying that this is everyone who is an anti-theist is stuck in a place of trauma. Absolutely not. But I have encountered that, and I have been in that place before. And again, I think part of what helped me make more peace with my trauma was having a more honest reckoning with, what religion actually is and how it functions.
Yeah. I mean, kind of related to what you said about how you would have received an anti-theistic message when you were religious. I've said to Sam, I mean, if you think the way to empower moderate forces within Islam and discourage extremism is for you, this American secular, atheists to walk up to them and grab them by the shoulders and say, "Don't you understand your God doesn't exist?" I mean, I'm sorry, but that's going to have the opposite of the intended effect.
Well, and there's research that shows this, right? When a dearly held belief is confronted in that way, oftentimes the response is to defend the belief, to sort of
to become more fundamentalist,
to become more deeply entrenched in it. And certainly, I would never say that, because we see it online and people talking about how, reading Sam Harris or reading Richard Dawkins, helps them kind of leave their fundamentalist faith and embrace being an atheist. So I don't want to say that it never works, but I do think that ultimately there is a way to promote a robust secular worldview that is not just about being in contrast to religion, but this I think is one thing that I talk about in the Vice piece, and what I think, part of, I think, the struggle for atheism is that we invest a lot of time and energy into talking about what we're not and to sort of pointing the finger elsewhere. And I think that makes it harder for us to, prevent folks who are involved in the movement from being recruited by the alt-right. I think if we spent more time talking about what a humanist kind of worldview has to offer people and making the case for that, I think that we could do a lot more good than if, and I just think that we're missing an opportunity to not just condemn, the alt-right and Richard Spencer and folks who are sort of moving in on movement atheism, but we're also missing an opportunity to make the case for why atheism doesn't have to lead to that, and how humanism has a sort of compelling contribution to make to the world, and how it can positively enrich people's lives.
And much of the point of your Vice piece, I guess, was that you were lamenting the fact that more prominent atheists had not condemned Richard Spencer after he started invoking atheism as an important part of his identity and ideology. Of course, that's Jerry Coyne. That's where I guess I forget exactly what he was complaining. What you tell me? Was he saying, "Look, we don't have," and you? This is a defensible view. I mean, a view worth hearing out. That it's not my job to condemn. I mean, he did finally condemn Spencer as a matter, as a formal matter, in the piece that I saw that he wrote. But he may have also been saying it isn't the responsibility of everyone to condemn everyone who has something in common with them and then does something abhorrent. Maybe that was part of his argument.
And I agree with that. I mean, I don't think that we have to go around issuing condemnations every time someone identifies themselves as an atheist. But the reason I was talking about that was that it wasn't just this sort of, that it was about more than just Richard Spencer, right? That it was these confluence of it was a confluence of factors aligned with a sort of silence. And part of why I wrote that piece was after I'd seen the interviews with Spencer, and I had not seen any of these sort of secular organizations say anything about it. I went digging, and I talked to someone who works at one of the major secular organizations in the US, one of the biggest ones. And this person told me that there was an explicit effort made internally by staff to get the organization to put out a statement condemning Spencer, and that effort was rejected. And when I asked that staff person why they thought that the organization didn't want to put out the statement, they didn't say it was because, they didn't think that atheists need to put out a statement condemning someone every single time they have, identified themselves as an atheist and promote abhorrent views. What they said was that they believed that the organization didn't want to estrange or alienate folks who were supportive of their organization and who were sympathetic to the alt-right or involved in the alt-right. And, I think that this is again where I think atheism as an organized force, as a movement, its focus on simply being a shared identity group for people who don't believe in God is going to get it into some problems, and has, because it makes it harder to draw the boundaries around the group and sort of manage what's going on inside the group. And, there's actually some emerging data from Interfaith Youth Corps that I think is relevant here. So they did a survey of college and university campuses in the United States. And one thing that they found was that the students they surveyed who identified as secular humanists, as opposed to the students who identified as atheist or agnostic or non-religious or nothing, the humanist students had a much higher commitment to their worldview. They were more involved in programs. They had a higher pluralism orientation. So they were more open to working with and learning from people who had different beliefs than they did. In all these different areas, they scored higher. And I think, my speculation is that it probably has something to do with having more of a sense of community. They're probably more plugged into a community, like what we were talking about sort of in the beginning of our conversation. But I also think it has to do with how you sort of orient yourself to the world. And I think if you build your sense of identity around thinking about what your values are and what you believe, as opposed to orienting yourself to the world in contrast by saying, I'm not like those other people, I disagree with those other people, I think it changes the way that you sort of move through the world and how you orient yourself toward difference. And I think that building a movement around humanism makes it more likely that the movement will be sort of thinking about what it does value, and as a result will be better able to navigate when things like this arise and say, okay, we as a movement don't want the involvement and support of people who are white nationalists, rather than an organization coming to the conclusion that they don't want to they just don't want to say anything because they don't want to alienate those people.
Okay, we're kind of running out of time, but I do want to revisit go back to the kind of the elite level, and as separate from whatever kind of grassroots demographic intersection there is between atheism and alt-right ideology. As I was saying, from the beginning I saw a kind of what I thought was a kind of rightward tilt, at least in the realm of foreign policy. To the kind of analysis that Sam Harris was doing, and Richard Dawkins, and Chris Hitchens, and you could also see the connection I alluded to, in that to the extent that you spend a lot of time ridiculing and disdaining Islamic belief, and maybe arguably by implication Muslims, you see a kind of a connection, however logical or not, between that and actual bigotry, because that, I'm not saying it is bigotry itself, but you at least see a connection between the two, and how the kind of rhetoric you might hear from some of the elite new atheists might be drawn on by people who are actually bigots. You can kind of see how that could happen. And again, it's not to say that the former is responsible for the behavior of the latter, but at least that's a kind of connection. But since then, other issues have arisen at the elite level. So there was the misogyny thing, where a few kind of prominent new atheists were accused of things. Now, the one person has now been caught up in the Me Too thing. Lawrence Krauss has actually, I think he's still under investigation by his college, Arizona State. It turned out he had been kind of, I guess, unofficially banned from a couple of...
Yeah, and he's not the only one. There was a recent BuzzFeed piece on David Silverman, who was president of American Atheists, the largest atheist organization in the U.S., who wrote the book Fighting God, and is which was, I think, the foreword or the blurb was from
Dawkins.
And so he's now no longer at American Atheists, but there have been a number of these instances.
And there, I don't like have a theory there, right? I mean, it could just be that because among the new atheists are actually, there are a lot of self-identified progressives who are part of that base. Mm-hmm. And it may be that, and certainly some feminists, and it may be that they're just more vigilant for in looking for and calling out misogyny and sexism. That could be. I don't really have another theory.
Well, I don't think, again, that atheism has more of a problem with this than other groups. But what I do think is that you've got, some of these bigger names in atheism who are saying things that, I think make it easier. They're kind of bridge issues or bridge ways of talking about it. And so, you've got, and it's a combination of issues. It's misogyny, it's anti-Muslim sentiment. And so you've got, Harris talking about how we should profile Muslims or anyone who looks like they could conceivably be Muslim at airports. You've got Dawkins kind of railing against feminists and social justice warriors. And, I think what it does is it kind of gives permission on a broader level for people to go even further than that. And again, I agree with you completely. I don't think that we can hold people responsible for every single thing that anyone they're have an acquaintance with has ever said or done. But I do think that, and people are allowed to make mistakes. They're allowed to say the wrong thing, to learn and grow. But I think we continue to see errors made in the same direction. So eventually it stops becoming a one-off error and it starts becoming more of a pattern of behavior. And, I don't think that the biggest names in atheism are themselves alt-right or even alt-right sympathetic. I think they think of themselves as being progressives, but I do think that they are enabling and sort of serving as gateways to people who are the sort of next ring out, and from there the next ring out, and so on. And so, why Sam Harris has to, have the author of The Bell Curve on to talk about, the science of race and IQ, and to kind of defend him as someone who has been the victim of a politically correct sort of witch hunt, or however he phrased it exactly. I mean, it just seems like I think the idea is that they believe, as skeptics, as people who really value free inquiry, that we need to hear all ideas and that no idea should be sort of, unspeakable. But the reality is we live in a world where racism, sexism, etc. aren't marginal things. In fact, they are the sort of air we breathe. And so I think prioritizing giving those ideas a platform in a world where those things already have a platform, I just think misses the mark on what I don't think it's functioning in the way that they think it is. And I think that what it does is, again, it mainstreams those things a bit among atheists, atheism as a sort of organized force, so that, someone can be a follower of Sam Harris and, hear Sam Harris sort of disagree with some of these things, but also still sort of give them a platform. And then they can see other atheists saying, actually, we agree with this. And I just think it makes those things more acceptable among, atheism as a movement. And so then you look sort of further down the chain and you see atheist YouTube accounts with 1 million subscribers that are pro-Trump and, railing against feminism and all of these kinds of things. And I don't think that there is no connection. I don't think it just happens to be the case that, Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or Bill Maher or others have occasionally said something or shared a platform with someone, and then it just so happens that, further down you've got folks who are saying things much more explicit. I don't think that there's no link whatsoever. And again, and it goes back to what you had said before, I don't think it's, I don't think you can look at Sam Harris's name on this list of people who are cited by, folks who are involved in the alt-right and say that, it's 100% Sam Harris's fault. But I also think that it doesn't, that there is a reason his name is on there.
Yeah, well, I would just think, if he doesn't approve of the alt-right, it might make sense to ask himself whether there's anything he's saying that he could say in an equally effective manner, equally reflecting his beliefs, that might be less inclined to attract the kinds of people he doesn't approve of. If that's the case, I mean, I would think it would be but it's up. And
I think, I think that, Sam Harris and others, they explicitly say, we condemn the alt-right, but then they also, share their platform with certain people and that sort of thing. And I think it sends a sort of mixed message, but I think they truly believe that saying I condemn the alt-right is, in and of itself is sort of powerful enough.
Yeah.
But I just think it.
I think I think one thing you said is right, that it makes sense that if you're an atheist, of course you champion free inquiry and will rail against perceived constraints on free inquiry. But I think there's another dynamic as well, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they start out, initially they say things maybe about Muslims or Islam that get them blowback from the left, from what they call the social justice warriors.
Mm-hmm.
And so the social justice warriors start to become their enemy. And I don't think this was at the very beginning. I don't think it was obvious. I mean, I think Sam thought of himself as a liberal, still does.
Right.
And in fact, when I first started saying, on foreign policy, you really can't call yourself a liberal because the implications of your ideas are just not progressive, he kind of he pushed back against that and emphasized all the ways he was a liberal at that debate with him. I'm on abortion and so on. And down the line, I want to emphasize I'm a liberal. But I think once they start getting blowback from the left, from social justice wars, then they naturally sympathize with whoever else is getting blowback. Charles Murray is getting blowback from their enemies. I think it's human nature to start to warm up to the people who are getting blowback from the same people you're getting blowback from. And I think you're actually, you mentioned Jordan Peterson. And I think he's, you mentioned him as somebody who, I think the presumption of what you said was that, well, he's right wing. I mean, you were saying he's one of the people that these people are appearing with. I think if you ask him, I think he contends he's not conservative, but I think at the same time, you're seeing some of the same dynamic with him.
Right. I absolutely
has issues
agree.
With the social justice warriors, then whoever they have issues with starts to become an ally of his. Maybe It's Ben Shapiro,
And I agree. And I think that's where it's not enough to simply say, these are the positions that I have, and that's why I am, obviously not aligned with the alt-right in any way. I really think like Jordan Peterson is a great example of this. If you look at who his fans are, I think they're not just drawn to him for no reason. And the same, I mean, it's a very complicated sort of phenomenon. Sam Harris, I have many friends who really admire Sam Harris, who listen to his podcast every week, who, or every episode, who, are big fans of him and are incredibly progressive and are not at all drawn to the alt-right. And so when I talk about Sam Harris, for example, serving as a gateway for some, I think it's only for a minority of people. But I don't think that you just can't look at the fact that there are people who are citing Sam Harris as, what sort of exposed them to this world and say that there's no connection at all. And I certainly, and this is something, I try to be really clear about, I am not an expert on these things. I think that there are people who are much more qualified to talk about these things than I am. But part of why I felt I needed to say something about this was because I was talking to all these people in movement atheism who I've known for many years, who also saw the same thing happening, who were also deeply concerned about it. And I just felt like it was important for me to say something about it, especially as a cisgender white man in a movement where, the voices of cisgender white men tend to kind of dominate the discussion. I felt like it was important for me to be a part of that conversation, but I do think that because I do think it is such a sort of complicated, and look, we're seeing all kinds of changes right now the alt-right is it looks very different from, it's a bizarre coalition of people, the alt-right, the alt-light, people who are sort of involved in that, who have vast disagreements on a number of things. Some are very anti-abortion and some are very supportive of it. Some are very anti-LGBT. Some are very supportive of LGBT protections and rights. And so I don't think you can just say I am, supportive of abortion. I am or access to abortion. I'm supportive of LGBT equality, and therefore I could not possibly be appealing to anyone who is in the alt-right, because I think these things are much more complicated. And so I hope that as these conversations continue, that people who are able to speak to these issues better than I can will continue to sort of be speaking out about this, because I think it's important. I think if atheists don't speak out about this, I think this intersection will deepen, because it just anecdotally, from what I and many other people who have been involved in the movement for years have observed, is that this is increasing, not sort of decreasing or stagnating, this overlap.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, for taking the time. In closing, why don't you just tell us quickly what you're up to now and where people can go to find, whether it's a Twitter handle or whatever, where you would steer them to find out more about you and your ideas.
Sure. So I'm living in Minneapolis now. I'm doing some research at Augsburg and with a number of local humanist organizations. We're building a survey right now to study the beliefs, practices, and community affiliations of the religiously unaffiliated to learn more about what they believe and what they're involved in. And then in addition to that, I am writing. I'm working on a new book, and you can find me online on Twitter. That's probably where I'm most active. My handle is Chris D. Stedman. I'm also on Facebook and so on.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.